not just April Fool's Day that you need to be worried about people trying to fool you with using biochemistry sounding stuff to sell you things like supplements. So today I want to talk a little about how we can evaluate these sorts of claims, save our money, maybe even like protect our health by not taking things that are potentially even dangerous for us. So I'm going to talk about how we can evaluate evidence with things called systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which kind of combine the evidence of multiple trials and experiments, but also then how those can be kind of misused and how then we need to evaluate the quality of the underlying studies. So yes, you have to put a little work in, but it'll hopefully save you in the long run. So I'll tell you about how you can kind of go about finding these sorts of information, as well as how you can go lazy routes to figure out kind of what the consensus is. I bring this up because it is very easy to, especially when you're beginning out in biochemistry and you're learning like a pathway or something, you see a connection between two molecules. And it makes it seem like, oh yeah, well, that makes total sense. Like if you supplement this molecule, you'll make more of this other molecule. But you have to remember that biochemistry is vastly more complex than things seem at first glance. All these pathways are interconnected, and so you can basically always find some sort of theoretical connection between two molecules, between A and B. But then once things actually get into the body, things are way more complicated than they are on paper, let alone the fact that even on paper, you could be drawing multiple pathways from different molecules. A kind of classic example of this is kind of the myth that eating a bunch of turkey at Thanksgiving makes you tired. And if you want to know more about this, I have a whole post on it. But bottom line is that the story goes that the amino acid tryptophan, there's a lot of it in turkey. Well, let's stop there. Turkey doesn't have more tryptophan than like other foods, like cheese has more. But anyway, if you take that at face value, we had a lot of tryptophan. Well, tryptophan is a precursor for making serotonin, that so-called like happy hormone, and melatonin, that like sleepy hormone. So makes sense, right? If you eat tryptophan, you get tired. Problem is that when you eat tryptophan, you're not just eating pure tryptophan, you're eating a bunch of other proteins. And well, those bunch of other proteins are going to compete with the tryptophan for actually getting into the cells that make the melatonin. And so you're not really taking in much more tryptophan because those other amino acids are competing. There are parts of your like brain that actually maybe do get a little more tryptophan because the tryptophan is going to be tied up in binding to the serum albumin in your bloodstream. And so then there's more available of it when it gets to the brain. And there are these higher affinity transporters and all this really cool stuff, but that's not the focus of this post. But those parts of the brain that actually make the melatonin aren't protected by that, don't have that same advantage. And so they're seeing the same as the rest of the body, in which the tryptophan is competing with all those other amino acids. So long story short, although it seems plausible that tryptophan could make you sleepy like that, things really aren't that simple. So speaking of things that aren't that simple, let's talk about meta-analyses and systematic reviews. These sound like such a great idea. Like, oh yes, these would totally allow us to see what the consensus is, combine all the results from all these different studies, and then kind of tell us, okay, what's the consensus? So we take these randomized controlled trials, we take cohort studies, we take all these different like case reports and things, we filter them, we combine them, we perform some statistical analyses on them in the case of a meta-analysis, and then we say, what's the finding? Problem is garbage in, garbage out. And so those results are only as good as the results of some sort of meta-analysis is only as good as the results of the individual studies. So I want to tell you a little bit more about these. So let's start with backing up and talking a little bit more in more detail about what's a systematic review and what's a meta-analysis. These terms are often used kind of like interconvertively, but when I looked into it a little more, meta-analysis is basically like a statistical method that researchers use in order to combine the findings from multiple studies and kind of give them different weights depending on how strong how strong of an experimental design it was and things like this. So it's more of like a statistical thing that is going to tell you whether or not there's an overall statistically significant result, significantly significant finding. Note about statistical significance is basically that just tells you if it's likely that two values really are different, or that there really is some sort of effect that is not likely to just be explained by chance. It doesn't tell you anything about the magnitude of the effect. And so, as I'll discuss later, we kind of need to think about, it may be statistically significant, but is it actually like clinically or meaningful significant? So if it gives something is shown to like statistically significantly give you involve like 0.5 seconds more of sleep per night, is that really worth spending hundreds of dollars for that supplement? Is it actually going to be a meaningful difference? So when we talk about statistical significance, there we're often going to see things like p-values, where it tells you kind of, you want the lower the p-value, the better. That's kind of like the likelihood that you would find it just by chance alone. But this is not a statistics thing. This is not statistic post or video or anything like that. And so talk to a statistician if you want to know more, or Google it, and there's a bunch of information out there. The focus of this is going to be on how we actually find those statistical findings. So that was the meta-analysis, and those are parts of systematic reviews. So not all systematic reviews have a meta-analysis, but meta-analyses are always parts of systematic reviews. So systematic reviews are kind of more overarching, and they evaluate the evidence from all sorts of different studies. It might involve kind of like a wider range of studies, maybe things that you can't directly compare one to another, in a way that would allow you to draw statistical conclusions, but that it evaluates the evidence that is out there and kind of collates it together, comments on it, and things like this. Often what these systematic reviews have in them that are really helpful are kind of these things called evidence tables. They have these different columns, and they tell you about the different studies that went into their analysis. So remember that whole garbage in, garbage out principle? They evaluate the evidence of the garbage that they're putting in, which hopefully isn't garbage, but the studies that are going in there. So they're going to tell you about what they were testing, how can you access this paper. So they'll have links and references for all of the papers so that you can go and look them up yourself. It's going to tell you if the results were statistically significant. So that's going back to that whole p-value thing, but also whether it was like the magnitude of the benefit. So was it actually like beneficial? Was it that like 0.5 seconds a night, or was it something like it actually gives you a meaningful difference that you could actually tell a difference? What was the quality of the study? The absolute risk reduction, absolute risk versus the relative risk. So absolute risk reduction of like 50% would be that you went from a risk of 51% to a risk of 1%, which would be huge. But a relative risk reduction of 50% could be that you went from a risk of 1% to a risk of 0.5%, or you went from a risk of like 0.001% to a risk of 0.0005%. So it wouldn't really be that meaningfully different, probably, unless we're talking a large number of people, which gets to the number needed to treat. So basically, how many people would have to actually take this treatment or do this thing in order for one person to benefit? So these are the types of things, as well as like various comments that you'll find in these evidence tables that can help you kind of quickly analyze the results. So how do you go about finding one of these meta-analyses or these systematic reviews? Well, you can go to PubMed, and I'll show you in a second how if you go to PubMed, you can kind of click on filter the data with this like systematic review button on the side, and that'll filter out just the systematic reviews. You can also just start from Google, just like type in your topic, use quotation marks to make sure that if it's a multi-word topic that all those terms are included. And then plus one of these other terms. And so it could be systematic review, meta-analysis, evidence-based. You can also often find kind of if there is a controversy, like sometimes you don't even know. And so you could type in like controversial, consensus, conflicting, differing, evidence. And you can search within an article for these terms like conflicting or differing or evidence to see who they're citing and then go and look at who they're citing. Going back, I want to show you a specific example, and we'll look at a little more detail in this example later on. But so you might have heard like a fad about there being like these chlorophyll supplements, and maybe you're like, oh yeah, chlorophyll, that sounds great. That's what plants have, right? It's going to have all these healthy effects, but does it really? And so if you go to PubMed and you type in chlorophyll and you search for systematic reviews, the first thing that pops up is an evidence-based systematic review of chlorophyll by the National Standard Research Collaboration. Long story short, basically, this is a systematic review where they look at all these studies that were looking at the effects of chlorophyll on various scientific claims. So note of warning, if you find a supplement that basically it's credited with curing all sorts of different things, like one of these like panaceas, is probably something fishy going on. If we look at the quality of the scientific evidence, we can see that for each of these different conditions, it's giving it a ranking. And well, one of them has a B, which is good scientific evidence. The rest of these have C's, which is unclear or conflicting scientific evidence. And so it tells you the criteria for these different things. So in this case, a grade of C corresponds to evidence of benefit from more than one small RCT, so randomized control trial, more about this in a second, without adequate size, power, statistical significance, or quality of design by objective criteria, or conflicting evidence, or things like this. So basically, there are strict followed criteria that go into giving things this grade, and it's not just willy-nilly. So I'll take you a little more detail into what you can find in this paper and this type of paper in a minute. But let's go back and talk about what is kind of, how do we judge the strength of the evidence itself? But before I get too far into the weeds, just a note that you might not always have time to do one of these deep dives. And if you don't know much about the topic, even if you're looking at a table like that, it can still be confusing. This is why it's important to also just like seek out trusted sources and multiple sources. One of my that's kind of collate the evidence and tell you about the findings in a simplified way. One of the sources that I really like is Science-Based Medicine. I like the podcast Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and one of the hosts, the co-host, Steve Novella, co-writes this blog, Science-Based Medicine, and they have a bunch of really great articles talking about kind of some of the fads that you hear about that are purported to treat various conditions and things, and they kind of summarize the evidence as well as provide links to where you can find more information. So recommend that. That's a good first place to go if you hear a claim and you don't have time to do a deep dive, or even if you do have time to do a deep dive, you kind of just want to see what some people that you trust think. Okay, now let's go and talk about how some of these studies can be biased. So first of all, correlation does not equal causation. Just because the numbers for both ice cream sales and pool drownings rise and fall together doesn't mean that ice cream causes drowning. It's more likely that, well, people buy ice cream and when it gets hot, and they go to the pool when it gets hot. So people are probably, there's going to be a correlation between ice cream sales and pool drownings, but those are not causally related. One does not cause the other. So you need to be on the lookout for that hidden variable, that change in the temperature that's out for the summer, things like that. Good studies in the case of dietary supplements, what we often need to look out for is variables like diet, exercise, socioeconomic status, underlying or coexisting health conditions, etc. So people who are more health conscious are more likely to kind of like have a healthier diet and exercise. Maybe if they are working all the time, they are going to not have time to have a healthier diet, or they don't have money to go and buy natural foods. Maybe they're working multiple jobs, they don't have time to exercise. All these things can be interconnected, and all these things need to be taken into account and controlled for, or else the findings aren't really valid. So how do we judge the quality of the evidence? we can look at some things that make a study kind of better or more trustworthy. One is the sample size. So the bigger is the better. Just the smaller the number of people, the more likely it is you're going to have like a chance finding, or you're going to have something that biases your results. So it's like if you flip a coin 2 times, both of them come up with heads, you'll say, oh, this coin is weighted, like it's always going to say heads, but you only flipped it 2 times. If you flipped it once, then you don't even know. And if you flipped it a ton of times, well, now you can have a better idea of whether or not the coin really is unfair or it's fair. So the bigger the sample size, the better. But it's not just the sample size that matters. A really important thing when it comes to sorts of dietary supplement studies is blinding, or as well as like any sorts of medical, like clinical result finding thingamabobs. You need blinding. Basically, this means that neither the person that's taking the thing nor the person that is like giving you the thing knows who's getting what. So this is only really possible in the case of a randomized control trial. So people are they volunteer for a trial and then they're given either a placebo, so like a sugar pill, or like the standard of care, or they're given some other treatment, the test treatment. This is not always possible. And a lot of times the results are the studies are actually going to be observational. So you say, okay, you ask people, okay, what did you eat? And then what is your weight or something? I mean, like there's some sort of measurement that is associated with something that people are already doing. And it's not that you're intervening with what they're doing. So that can be dangerous because of all those conflicting factors that we talked about, and then I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Another thing you want to be on the lookout for is this thing called p-fishing. So as I mentioned earlier, there's that thing called the p-value, and basically you want a low p-value. A p-value of like 0.05 would mean that there is a 5% chance that if the result is just by chance. So if you were to do 20, you were to look for 20 different things, you could expect that one of those things would show you an effect, even if there wasn't really an effect, just by chance alone. Therefore, the more things that you test for, the more likely you are to find something that does have one of those statistically significant effects. And so people will often test for a bunch of different things or look for tons of different correlations, and to find one that is going to be statistically significant, and then they'll report that as like, aha, there is a statistically significant effect that it benefits blah, blah, blah. But they're not mentioning those 99 other things that they tested for that they didn't find any effect. And then you have to think about whether that effect itself was actually meaningful or not. You also need to think about, well, what is the risk versus the benefits? So all these things are not necessarily inert. So there could be side effects, adverse events. Some of this stuff can actually be really dangerous, especially if you take a lot of it. And then, of course, the wasted money. Another thing with like the side effects and stuff is often that these supplements aren't regulated very well. And so they might have big safety concerns or quality concerns that aren't going to be as overlooked, or they're not going to be as caught as easily as for things like our pharmaceutical drugs. Don't undervalue the power of biases, both conscious and unconscious. So going back to the idea of kind of like people are volunteering for trials, or they're volunteering to give you information about what they do. So who's likely to volunteer? Is it likely to be those people who are like health conscious and wanting to do anything to improve their health? Is it likely to be people who are already at the doctor or who are in some sort of population where they're being solicited to give their help? Or is it going to be the person who has no time because they have 3 jobs and they're doing all this stuff? And so you can easily get these biased results based on just sorts of who's volunteering and who's likely to self-report. People also, like, if people think that something is helping them, they're more likely to tell, like, oh yeah, this thing was helping me. Or if they think that something's hurting them, oh yeah, this thing was hurting me. But if you're just like, I have no idea, are you really likely to kind of like go and report something? And then who's funding the studies? So often, if the funding is coming from the people that have something to benefit, they're going to skew the trial in a way that makes it so that they're more likely to get positive results. And if they get negative results, they're less likely to publish it. So there's a high bias towards publishing positive results and not publishing negative results. Always, always, always keep in mind regression to the mean. Things will usually get better, like with or without intervention, unless we're talking about some major medical thing, some medical thing. Like, I'm not saying go to a doctor, not at all, but things often get better, even if you don't go to the doctor. And I'm talking about little things here again. Please go to the doctor if you need to go to the doctor. But if you get a paper cut, your paper cut is likely going to get better on its own. If you put, like, I don't know, if you do some weird thing to maybe you snap your finger 5 times and then your paper cut gets better. Well, your paper cut was already going to get better, but now you're associating it getting better with the snapping of your fingers. And so you say, aha, snapping fingers makes your paper cut get better. So you need to keep this in mind that similar things happen. You are going to seek out help when you are often like at your worst or you're doing bad. And then you're going to get better because you were going to get better anyway, but now you're going to credit some sort of intervention. So you often will hear this with people like when they take supplements or something, some pseudoscientific treatment. They're going to be like, I did this and I got better, but you would have gotten better anyway. But again, please go to the doctor, people. Okay, know that the placebo effect is powerful. So this isn't saying that it's all in your head, just that your head affects your body. And it can affect your body very powerfully, which is why it's important to, in those randomized trials, have them be placebo-controlled so that people don't know whether or not they're receiving the treatment. Because if they think they're receiving the treatment, they might report more of a benefit or even physically have more of a benefit because of that like mind over matter type of stuff. But often we can't really do a placebo-controlled trial with things like dietary interventions because it's not like you can kind of you can't really control for things as well when it comes to human behavior. And it's not really ethically possible to do so. And it's kind of obvious to tell if you are being told, if you're like having to exercise 20 minutes a day versus 10 minutes a day, you can't really be like, oh, you make the people who are exercising 10 minutes think they're really exercising 20 minutes and things like that. So it's really complicated, which is why it's really important that we are able to kind of have a way to evaluate this evidence. And that takes us back to the systematic reviews and our meta-analyses. These, however, we need to interpret them with caution because they can also be used to kind of make results that are not really meaningful seem meaningful. It all depends on kind of like what you include in the study, what you don't include, and how you evaluate the evidence. It's really challenging because comparing different studies is inherently difficult. This is because things like populations differ greatly, as well as the experimental methods and all sorts of things. This is a really great article that I will link to, The Misuse of Meta-Analysis in Nutrition Research by Barnard et al. In JAMA, so the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they talk about, they give some great examples of kind of how meta-analyses, you might hear like the results be announced in the news and stuff and actually cause policy changes, but they're based on comparisons that aren't really valid. So for example, they talk about a 2014 meta-analysis that examined the relationship between saturated fat intake and coronary artery disease. So there were these 2 studies, or one of these studies was this like Oxford vegetarian study, and they reported that saturated fat intake ranging from 6 to 7% of energy in vegan participants was about twice that of the other diet groups. However, of like all those in the highest tertile of saturated fat intake can nearly triple the risk of fatal ischemic heart disease compared to the lowest. So then it was like, aha, eating saturated fats is going to be correlated with a higher risk of heart disease. In this other study, however, well, now they found that they had there was no effect between having a higher saturated fat intake and heart disease. However, their lower end of saturated fat intake was 13%. And well, in this study, that was basically going we only had the 6 to 7% was going to be our high in the other study. So you can't really directly compare these. And as they say, like only 1.2% of the present study population actually followed the recommendations of less than 10% of your energy on saturated fat intake. And so this saturated fatty acids cardiovascular disease hypothesis is thus not fully testable in this population. That doesn't stop the New York Times from claiming butter is back and Times from being like, eat butter and all of this stuff. So yeah, so then less people started limiting fat in their diets and things like this. And so basically the populations can differ and that can give you wildly different results. You also have to consider like what are we comparing between? So whether or not something is statistically different is going to depend on like, well, what are you comparing it between? Like, is a 5-year-old going to be, is a 5-year-old boy going to be taller than a 2-year-old boy? Well, yeah, but is a 5-year-old boy going to be taller than a 5-year-old girl? Not necessarily. Or, I mean, that sort of thing. It's like, who are you comparing between? So this is another like fat-based study, and they were looking at associations between red meat intake and blood lipid concentrations. This one trial, so most of these trials are going to compare red meat with other meats, and they're like, oh, there's no little apparent relationship with LDL cholesterol. And then 5 of the 39 studies compared red meat to plant-based foods, and they found that there was non-significantly increased LDL cholesterol after red meat consumption. So they conclude that red meat does not negatively influence cardiovascular disease risk factors. But they haven't really tested enough groups that were comparing the red meat to plant meat versus the red meat with other types of meat. And so they say a better approach would focus on a single comparator and ensure that an adequate number of studies had used the methods of interest. Another important thing is that you have to think about what are they doing if they're not eating one type of food. So if they aren't eating fats, maybe it's because they're eating a bunch more carbs, or maybe it's because they're eating a bunch more protein. And so by kind of not knowing what that other thing is, you can then have skewed findings. So now let's go and let's look at a little more detail in that systematic review so I can show you a little more about what goes into it and what type of information that you can expect to find there. They're going to start by basically telling you how they went about their methodology. And so just like the papers that go into these papers have methodology, so do these systematic review papers. They have to tell you, well, how did they find these articles? How did they choose which studies to include? And remember that this is a point in which bias can be introduced. By selectively choosing to exclude studies that go against what you want them to show, and including studies that have findings that are in line with what you're hoping that the result will be, that's a way that these can be easily biased. And so this is where it's important to kind of keep an eye out of who's funding or who's writing the review. Is it going to be like the company that's selling the product, or is it going to be more of an independent review group? So they're telling you how they selected the studies and then how they reviewed the studies. So they basically have these standardized instruments that pertain to each review section. So basically they have rubrics and things that these different reviewers use. And then they have 2 people actually being reviewing things. The reviewers were blinded. And so I think that just means that they basically didn't know where the study was coming from, like which group, where it was done or whatever. And in the case of disagreement, then they had a panel actually discuss it and consult other people if needed. So lots of kind of checks went into account to make it so that this was as fair as a comparison or as fair as an analysis as possible. That doesn't mean that the comparisons are fair, because then again, that's where you have to take into account the different findings. They talk about different like synonyms and acronyms and things like this. One of the things with like chlorophyll supplements is that the form of chlorophyll that is given as a supplement isn't really the same form as it's given, like it is found in food. And so that could complicate things. But anyway, because that's like chlorophyllin. But yeah, let's go into this finding. So they tell you about kind of like the bottom line effectiveness, the background, what it's claimed to be effective in, and then it lays it out. Here's the summary, the kind of grades each of these on all these different claims, and tells you what these grades correspond to. So it's not just saying, it's not just making a claim, it's actually based on how good the evidence is. So that's a nice, like, quick view. But if you want to find out more, you want to figure out, okay, well, what were the studies that went into this and what specifically did they find? How did they come to give you that grade? Well, now it's going to go into more of the information. It talks about all these various studies, some things that basically it's been folklore, so people say it does this, but is there actually that? Talks about safety, so is it safe? Who is it safe for? It's not always safe for everybody. Some of like the adverse effects, dosing and standardization, various different things. So there's a lot. Yeah, adverse effects. So like I said, these things aren't always inert. So there are warnings and contraindications. So like, don't take this if you have this, or if you have that, use with caution here and here. And well, often what happens too is that because people don't really think of these as medicines, when they go to their doctors, they're not telling their doctors that they're taking these things, and well, maybe they're taking something else, or maybe they're in one of these contraindicated groups that they don't know, and their doctors then don't know. And so then this can cause issues. So if you are going to take any sort of supplement, be sure you're actually telling your doctor so that you're making sure that there aren't any adverse, like don't take if you have this sorts of thing, or don't take in conjugation with this, because again, like these are all like over-the-counter things that aren't well regulated. And so the risk of those sorts of kind of bad interactions are greater when we're talking about these supplements than if we're talking about some sort of prescribed drug in which your doctor is part of the system and there's a pharmacist involved making sure that everything is good. So, but yeah, you can find a lot of really cool information in here. And so sometimes there really is some cool science going behind it. The science might not always pan out to be the way that so that a supplement would actually be helpful. But there are this will kind of show you how you can go and find those different studies and look into things deeper. And maybe you'll find some cool biochemistry going on, even if it's not necessarily chemistry that translates to being useful as a supplement. Some important things to keep in mind, no matter what you're evaluating, is that everything has chemicals. And so I embarrassed my mom once we went to this like peddler's fair, farmer's market-y type thing. And there was someone that they were selling these products and they were claiming that they were chemical free. And I was like, well, nothing's chemical free. And they're like, oh yes, it's chemical free. I'm like, water is a chemical. Everything is a chemical. We're made of chemicals. Chemicals are awesome. But yeah, no. Anyway, naming them scientifically doesn't make them any different. So if we say dihydrogen monoxide, we're still talking about water, and it's that same H2O, that same good old thing that we love so much. But remember that natural doesn't equal healthy and or better. So natural arsenic and synthesized arsenic are chemically the same and chemically just as deadly. And that doesn't mean that all things that are chemically synthesized are bad, though, because, well, often things that are chemically synthesized are more well-controlled and more pure and things like this than the things that are quote unquote natural. And sometimes the things that are natural are things like crust up insect skeletons to make red dyes so that you don't have to use synthetic dyes. So natural does not equal better, and natural does not equal safe. Speaking of safe, the dose makes the poison. So even water can kill you if you drink enough of it. Remember that animals aren't people. So a lot of times the results of things that are done like in the animal trials, or even just like in cells in a dish, those are going to be reported like, oh, this causes this or that causes that. But those cells in the dish are not a whole person. And even that mouse is not a whole person. It's not even a person. Speaking of people, each person's different. No person's perfect, and no study is perfect, which is why those meta-analyses and systematic reviews come in handy, because, well, no one study is perfect. Combining the results of multiple studies can give you a better sense of what the actual, what's real and what's just noise. However, those are all just as valid as the study that actually went into them. And so that's why we need to critically analyze the evidence within those different studies. In general, there's a bunch of fads out there, but don't fall for them. Just eat a well-balanced diet and you shouldn't need supplements. Make sure to exercise, and just basically you can do pretty much everything in moderation is probably fine. I myself am a vegetarian, but you can eat meat, just not a lot of meat. Mostly vegetables is what's typically better. Everything in moderation. Don't fall for the fads. Get some exercise and use that newfound biochemistry knowledge with caution. I know myself, it can be easy to kind of draw these connections, and these connections are awesome, but things in the real world are more complicated.